Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to be here today. We're happy to have you. My name is Sam Bruder, and I'm the Caseflow Coordinator with the Centralized Small Claims Office based here in Hartford, together with Allison Chandler, who I think just stepped out. We have co-chaired this year's Diversity Week Subcommittee of the Advisory Committee on Cultural Competency. We're really excited to be part of this. This is Allison. Diversity Week takes a lot of support, but I wanted to specifically thank Chief Justice Rogers, whose support means that this essential event can happen even in financially challenging times. I would also like to thank someone else who you will hear from more later as our keynote speaker, and that is Justice Richard Robinson, whose leadership has helped guide us here today. Now, for something a little different than in years past, we have a small set of icebreaker questions that I will be asking. I request you to simply raise your hand if the question applies to you, and my co-chair, Allison, will be keeping a rough tally. This is a quick exercise to get everyone in the right frame of mind for the rest of this morning's activities. How many people here have worked for the branch less than 3 years? How many have been with us for 3 to 10 years? Greater than 10 years? So minus it out of 2. How many people were born in Connecticut? How many people were born outside the U.S.? How many people have traveled outside the U.S.? Just want to make sure I have the order. How many people here are parents? How many people identify as more than one race? How many people identify as more than one ethnicity? How many people have seen a Spike Lee movie? How many people have lived in another country? And lastly, how many people know American Sign Language? As you can see, we have a lot of diversity in this room. Let's use today and the rest of this week to recognize our diversity and learn more about one another. And now join me in welcoming our Chief Justice with the opening remarks.
Good morning, everybody. I want to thank Sam and Allison for that interactive welcome, and thank you both for serving as co-chairs of the Planning Committee. You, in addition to all of the committee members, have done an excellent job in planning this year's celebration, and it's, per usual, an honor to be here and actually one of my favorite days of the year. So, as I approach, believe it or not, my 10-year anniversary as Chief Justice, I've had some time to reflect over the past decade. And as part of that reflection, I came across some remarks that I relied upon way back during my swearing-in ceremony in 2007. By way of background, Father Mark Massa presented these remarks during a homily at Fordham University, and his main message was, think small, act large. Father Massa explained that thinking small is, quote, that you should focus your attention on those things you can do something about, namely about yourselves and the things over which you have some degree of control, your words, your habits, your heart, your soul. Think small and get the job done in the next 15 hours, unquote. For me, personally, that means doing regular gut checks to make sure that I'm listening to others, that I'm being respectful of others, and that I'm articulating my views in a way that is not offensive to others. I'm not 100% successful at this all of the time, but I want to promise you that I do try. All of this week's programs will be helpful to you in thinking small and getting the job done. In other words, many of the things you're going to learn about can make a huge difference. Hopefully, these programs will prompt you to think about such things as, how can I be more sensitive to people from other cultures? And how can these programs help me to be a more effective public servant and the kind of colleague who values diversity, not only by my words, but also by my actions? Additionally, the celebration today and throughout the week offers you a tremendous opportunity to act large. Or as Father Massa explained, it means living your life generously, being extravagant in your hopes for making the world a better place, and being ambitious in your aspirations, especially for others, so that you will have a role in translating hopes into reality. Therein is the crux of why programs such as today's are so important. You have not only the opportunity to think small, but also to act large beyond these walls and into the future. While I am not and cannot be political, I think everyone in this room today would agree that there has never been a more critical time to address diversity as we look at what is going on in this country and around the world. Quite simply, we owe it to ourselves, our families, and our communities to intrinsically respect our differences rather than fear them. As Chief Justice, I've taken very seriously the branch's role in promoting diversity. I'm proud of the accomplishments that have occurred over the past decade, but I'm very well aware that more needs to be done. In that regard, I'm hopeful that an upcoming branch-wide survey, as part of our focus in improving the workplace for all of you, will help in achieving this goal. The survey is going to be distributed on November 1st via email and is designed to gauge your satisfaction and engagement in your job and work environment. The sole purpose of obtaining this information is to identify ways in which the branch can support you, provide you with meaningful career paths, and make improvements that will enhance your work experience and your environment. I want to note that the survey is completely anonymous and voluntary, although I'm really hoping that each and every employee will take the time to complete it. We're then going to provide you with the results of the survey. I should mention that we also anticipate following up with a series of voluntary focus groups, like we did with the strategic plan, where we'll further call your thoughts on what we do well and where we can improve. I'm hopeful that this survey is going to act as a valuable tool in identifying ways that will enhance the diversity and the cultural competency of our workforce. So in closing, please know that I really do appreciate all that you do each and every day. I don't get out to see all of you, but I know the work and the great work that you're doing. Your work is important and it makes a difference in people's lives, and I remain both humbled and proud of all of your dedication. Thank you very much.
All right, now we are going to have Justice Robinson come and address us. He is, as Sam had said, the chair of the Advisory Committee on Cultural Competency. He's been a wonderful leader for us, and he really lives this idea every day. So please welcome him as he gives our address.
Thank you, Allison. Before I begin, I'd like to start with some unprepared remarks. And I'm going to thank Allison officially in a second, but I absolutely drove her crazy over the last few weeks because she wanted copies of my PowerPoint about what I was going to talk about. I was telling some folks earlier today, what I'm going to speak about actually is the fifth draft of what I was trying to write over the past year, because as the Chief Justice just mentioned, this has been a very, very strange time in our politics in our nation. So it was very difficult to try to balance what I wanted to say and be optimistic and uplifting. The PowerPoint that I'm not going to use, I'm actually going to use a piece of that now. It shows you how this has been with me. But this, let me go back. Stop looking at that one. You are not allowed to look at that one. This slide is a picture of my family tree, a very small part of my family tree. There's actually over 1,000 people in it now. But if you look up to the left, you'll see my great-grandfather, David Daniel Darius Robinson. His mother and father were actually slaves. He was the first free person in my family. And that's had a great impact on who I am today. 4 generations ago, my great-great-grandparents, Isaiah and Matilda, were born into slavery. On June 30th, 1878, Matilda gave birth to my great-grandfather, John David Darius Robinson. He's the first person in our branch of the family to become a free person. He's holding my older brother there. We actually have a picture of him holding me, and I'm crying my head off, and it was quite embarrassing. So I figured sacrifice my brother. He's not here. The picture was embarrassing because I was crying at the top of my lungs, and I can imagine that it was quite a strain on my elderly great-grandfather to be tasked with the duty of holding a writhing, crying child while trying to maintain that smile. I am told that I was quite a mama's boy, and that crying was my reaction to being separated from her. For me, that was probably a couple of minutes, but for Papa Dan, it must have been an eternity. 15 years before Papa Dan was born, and while Isaiah and Matilda were still in servitude, I doubt if they knew that in a state north to the farm to which they were bound, a great battle had been fought, and it was time to lay the fallen to rest. Edward Everett, the former U.S. Secretary of State, U.S. Senator, U.S. Representative, Governor of the state of Massachusetts, and one of the greatest orators of his time, was asked by attorney David Wills to give the main speech at a dedication ceremony. In the styles of the time, Everett began his 2-hour, 13,607 word speech, just 2 words shorter than the one I'm going to give you today. I don't understand. With these moving words, standing behind the serene sky, overlooking these broad fields now reposing from the labors of the waning years, the mighty Alleghanies dimly towering before us, the graves of our brethren beneath our feet. It is with hesitation that I raise my poor voice to break the eloquent silence of God and nature. But the duty to which you have called me must be performed. Grant me, I pray you, your indulgence and your sympathy. The speech was well received by the public, and the newspapers reported it as being a great success. Attorney Wills asked a fellow lawyer to be the next speaker. This speaker was told by Wills to keep his remarks brief because Mr. Everett was the main speaker. In compliance with these instructions, the brief remarks consisted of only 10 lines, consisting of 272 words. Its brevity shocked the audience. It was immediately seen as a failure. Broken-hearted, the speaker mounted his horse, rode back to his hotel, depressed, alone, and in great despair. To give you some idea how poorly the speech was received by the media, shortly after that fateful day, a local newspaper reported it in its editorial session, and it said, "We pass over the silly remarks of the guest speaker for the credit of the nation. We are willing that the veil of oblivion shall drop over them, and they shall no longer be repeated or even thought of." Although there is no known historical record of how the speaker felt about the speech after that, I'm sure he thought his words would be lost in the passage of time, but fortunately, he was wrong. His historical speech started out with these simple words: 407 years ago. It's interesting to note that on November 14th, 2013, almost 150 years after the original publication of the editorial piece, the Patriot News of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the paper that took over the Patriot and Union News, the original publisher of the editorial, printed this following retraction. Our predecessors, perhaps under the influence of partisanship or strong drink, as was common in the profession at the time, called President Lincoln's words silly remarks deserving a veil of oblivion. The Patriot News regrets the error. I cannot promise you a Gettysburg Address today, but I will endeavor to keep these remarks memorable. Good morning. Thank you for giving me the privilege of speaking at this incredible event. Before we begin, I know that it's always dangerous to single out individuals to thank, because no matter how hard you try, you end up leaving someone out. But I must at least try to recognize the people that have helped make this event possible. First, I want to thank the Advisory Committee on Cultural Competency. It is their commitment and dedication that is making it possible for us to achieve our goal of the judicial branch, that serves the interests of justice and the public by resolving matters brought before it in a fair, timely, efficient, and open manner. I have the privilege of working with incredible people who work full-time jobs for the branch and that go the extra mile to make this world a better place to live in. I want to personally thank Allison Chandler and Sam Broder, the Diversity Week Committee and its subcommittees, for the countless hours that they put into bringing this project together. Each year we have raised the bar as to our expectations of the breadth and quality of the program, and each year you've somehow managed to exceed our expectations. I want to thank you, Chief Justice Rogers, for your never-ending commitment to the people of the state of Connecticut to provide them with equal access to justice by addressing and eliminating the issues that create real and perceived barriers. Your sincere commitment to this goal is one of the main reasons that the branch has accomplished so much and made us a leader and national model in providing access to justice and improving, understanding, and embracing our diversity. With me today are my wonderful wife, Nancy, our son, Jonathan. I want to thank you both for coming today and for the love and support that you guys have shown me throughout the years. Nancy and John are sitting with our good friends, the Antonucci's. Their sons, Scott and Brian, and as well as them, of course, we've become very close friends. We've become like family. We've had many breakfasts, lunches, and dinner together over the past few years, and our open and honest talks around the dining room table have been a source of inspiration and strength. Difficult but necessary conversations about culture, race, gender, and sexuality, conversations that we so desperately need to have, but have a way of avoiding. It is through these conversations that we have gotten past our knee-jerk emotional responses and now have a much better understanding of each of us, and our friendship has truly deepened. Thank you, Joe and Madeline. When the Diversity Week Committee asked me to speak at this event, I was more than a little bit hesitant to do it. To be frank with you, I didn't know if I could. We're in one of those uneasy periods where the national conversation on politics, religion, race, culture, gender, sexuality is causing a great deal of angst. There has been a pushback on the advancements that we've made over the past few decades. I would be lying to you if I said I am not concerned about what has been going on. Yes, I've seen pushbacks before. In fact, there's always pushbacks after times of great advancements in social justice, like the passage of the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution, which abolished slavery, or the 19th Amendment that gave women the right to vote, or the repeal of the separate and equal doctrine, and the recognition of marriage equality as a constitutional right. Like you, I have witnessed what is going on, and I've been feeling a wide range of emotions like anger, fear, grief, and yes, even despair. When Allison and Sam asked me to speak, I wondered how could I ever make remarks before an audience when I was feeling so troubled about the things that I've been hearing and seeing. I had these thoughts with me on a trip that my wife and I took with another couple to New Orleans a couple of weeks ago. I thought the trip would be an excellent opportunity to lift my spirits, recharge my batteries, and give me some fresh insights. It turns out I was right. Those who attended last year's Diversity Week opening program probably remember our keynote speaker, Keith Woods, was from New Orleans. One of the things I remember asking Mr. Woods about before he spoke was, where should I go in New Orleans to get some really good gumbo? His response was, "It's obvious from your question that you've never been to New Orleans, because the answer is everywhere." Well, I can tell you, he was right. The gumbo, shrimp and grits, jambalaya, etouffee, beignets, and chicory coffee were amazing. I'm still trying to work off the pounds that I gained there, but I have no regrets. As I said to my wife, "Nance, don't worry about the extra pounds. I'll get back in shape pretty quickly." What I didn't tell her is that I believe round is a perfectly acceptable shape. During our trip, I couldn't help but notice two things: how old the city was and the interactivity of a very diverse population. However, even though New Orleans appears to be more racially and culturally diverse than any other place I've been before, it still has its issues. Nancy and I traveled with our good friends, David and Tina Prowse. The Prouses are wonderful friends. They are a little bit younger than us. They work in the tech world, and they happen to be white. I mention their race only because it's relevant to this discussion. While on our trip, there were 3 incidents that we experienced that gave us the opportunity to openly and honestly talk about issues of race and culture. The first incident occurred when we were checking in our hotel. There were 2 individuals at the front desk. The Prouses were standing in front of us, and one of the desk clerks called us to her station to talk. She welcomed us all to New Orleans and started working with the Prouses. She immediately asked them, did they want to upgrade to one of the hotel's more luxurious accommodations on Bourbon Street, and then start to explain the various options. The other front desk person was now ready to work with Nancy and me. She called us up to her station and welcomed us in that same warm and friendly professional manner that her coworker did. She then proceeded to check us into the courtyard room, the back of the hotel, on the 5th floor, without ever mentioning any other options. Right now, I'm guessing that some of you probably have drawn conclusions about what happened. If you guessed that the person who checked the Prouses in was also white, you are correct. If you guessed what happened was an act of racism or prejudice, I think you are probably wrong. You see, the person that checked Nancy and me in was black. Unfortunately, we will never know whether it was poor training, our imagination, or implicit bias that caused her to fail to offer us the upgrade opportunities that her coworker offered our friends. Remember, when it comes to implicit bias, members of minority groups often unwittingly adopt the biases of the majority culture. The next incident occurred the next day when we were walking on Bourbon Street. A man that we were passing commented to his friends in a voice loud enough for us to hear. In fact, I think he wanted me to hear. He said, "I think they are both Negroes." Nancy turned and looked at me, using that way of communicating that couples who have been together for many years use, and mouthed the words, "What the hell?" Because of our different hues, we have experienced this issue more than once during our 23-year relationship. We've been traveling since our early days together and have gone to places like the Netherlands, Lublin, Poland, Palermo, Sicily, Narita, Japan, Luoyang, China. Nancy would often go unnoticed because of her appearance. She calls it being ethnically ambiguous. She can blend into almost any population, while I, on the other hand, am often the center of very much unwanted attention. Any public displays of affection between us were often met with stares or comments. Nancy and I briefly discussed what happened. Although Tina and David had not heard the gentleman speaking, Nancy and I took the opportunity to bring them into our world by discussing it with them. At the same time, we let them know that they were in a safe zone and that it was a conversation about race and color that we wanted. No, we actually needed to have. A third incident occurred a couple of days later when we were walking back to our hotel from the Café du Monde. We just had our fill of beignets and café au lait for breakfast. We went there 3 times. We're pigs. We really are. And we're going back. And obviously, chemically and or psychologically impaired individuals was ambling in our direction. He looked at Nancy and then headed directly at us in a menacing manner. I was slightly behind my wife, and I could see that she immediately started to get into a defensive posture. My first thought was, this dude is about to eat a sidekick. Nancy is a 6th-degree black belt. Jonathan, my son, is a 4th-degree black belt. Mr. Antonucci is an 8th degree black belt. I am a lowly 3rd degree black belt. You folks are well protected today. Nancy, although she's a 6th degree black belt, I'm sorry about that, the man started raving at her and saying something about black, and I honestly won't say the rest of the words because they were that bad. He then looked at the posture Nancy was in, reevaluated the situation, scurried off in a different direction. We were all left there staring at each other with a "what the hell" expression. We discussed what happened as we walked our way back to our hotel. David and Tina actually apologized for the negative racially charged things that had happened on our vacation. I silently wondered, why did they feel the need to apologize? But I must admit, I was simply too embarrassed to ask them. Instead, we explained to them that there was nothing for them to apologize for, and told them out of the sea of people that we had met during our trip, there were only 2 people who expressed any kind of negative issues about race. On the 3rd day of our trip, we stopped in this little boutique that sold hats, shoes, wallets, and other items made of cork. I didn't even think you could do that. The first thing I noticed was that when we went into the store were the video surveillance cameras. It seems that the norm of New Orleans is to have an abundance of surveillance cameras everywhere, both inside and outside of stores. The sales clerk greeted us with a warm smile and that wonderful southern hospitality. She showed us a few items and then went to another part of the store to assist another customer. David was looking at a cork wallet that he was interested in purchasing, but he was concerned about whether it would fit into his back pocket. He then did what I thought was the craziest thing. He took his own wallet out of his back pocket and handed it to Tina. He then tried out the cork wallet by putting it into his back pocket. I went into a major freak out and became a bundle of nerves. This is something that I would never think of doing. When I'm in a store, I'm consciously making sure that I don't do anything that would lead a store employee to believe that I am stealing. I walk in the middle of aisles, away from the merchandise, until I must interact with it. I don't pick up anything in a way that someone could think that I was trying to hide it in my clothing. I put things back with big gestures so that people will know that I've actually put the item back. Some of you may think that this is rather drastic, but my life experiences, including a few years of working in retail myself, have taught me that as a black male, I am always under surveillance by store security. In fact, it was only a couple of years ago while I was on my way to a campsite that I realized I'd forgotten to bring insect-repelling tiki torches. I stopped at a hardware store in Winstead, Connecticut. Taking all of my usual precautions, I picked up 4 torches and brought them to the counter. When I was paying for them, the store clerk noticed that one of them was broken. I told him that I would simply go back and get another one to replace it. He told me, no, just pick one up on your way out of the store. I asked him, was he sure? Because I didn't want to be accused of stealing anything, and he assured me that it was okay. On my way out, I picked up the torch as instructed and was almost immediately grabbed by another employee who accused me of stealing. The cashier that helped me earlier ran up because he heard the commotion. I think I would have actually enjoyed the look on his face if I had not been so angry. On the 4th day of our trip, we hired a tour guide to take us to a tour of one of the oldest cemeteries in New Orleans. A short time into our tour, we came to a simple white tomb that was engraved with the name Homer Plessy. It was at this moment that things began to come into sharper focus for me. Mr. Plessy was the plaintiff in the infamous United States Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson. This case held that separate was equal under our U.S. Constitution. On June 7, 1892, Mr. Plessy, an octoroon, which meant he was 1/8 black, got onto a train in Louisiana, in accordance with the plan of the New Orleans Citizens Committee, entered into a whites-only railroad car. He did this to contest Louisiana's Separate Car Act, a law that required segregation in railroad cars. Mr. Plessy looked white, and the authorities did not know that he was black until he told them that he was. He was subsequently arrested and found guilty of violating the act. The case eventually worked its way up to our Supreme Court. Although Plessy argued that the Separate Car Act violated the 13th and 14th Amendments of the Constitution, the Supreme Court determined that separate but equal laws did not violate our Constitution. While I was staring at that tomb, I realized that it was not enough that Nancy, David, Tina, and I just talk about recent events. To have a real understanding of who we are and what was happening, it was important to talk about how we got that way. There are extremely important reasons that we should learn, know, and embrace our histories. Our personal history, our national history. Not just some of it, all of it. The painful as well as the pleasant, the happy as well as the sad, the good and the bad. I believe that unless we understand where we've been, we can't possibly understand where we can go. I then thought about the world that Mr. Plessy lived in. I thought about the fact that my great-grandfather, Papa Dan, was only a 14-year-old boy when Mr. Plessy was arrested. I thought about the times I heard people say that those things happened a long time ago. I'm not responsible for what happened back then. Why does it matter now? Well, it matters because it wasn't so long ago. It matters because the ripples of time still impact on what is happening today. It matters because a man who actually lived through those days held me in his lap on a porch in North Carolina. I thought about a horrible Sunday morning that occurred 2 years before my birth. An event that occurred in a little town called Money, Mississippi, when a frightened 14-year-old black child named Bobo endured a night of terror at the hands of J.W. Milliam and his half-brother, Roy Bryant. In his last moments on earth, the last thing Bobo heard was Milliam ordering him to pick up a 74-pound ginny wheel. He staggered under his weight and carried it to the riverbank. He lowered the wheel to the ground and silently stared at his tormentors. Milliam then told him to take off his clothes. Slowly, Bobo pulled off his shirt, his socks. He stood up, dropped his pants and his shorts, and stood there naked. It was Sunday morning, a little before 7. Milliam said, and this is actually from a transcript that Milliam gave an interview to Time magazine, "You still think you're as good as I am?" Bobo said, "Yeah." Milliam said, "You still think you can talk to a white woman?" Bobo said, "Yeah." Bobo, a child, refused to back down and submit. This was simply too much for Milliam to take. A second later, he squeezed the trigger of his .45. A shot rang out, and a bullet tore through Bobo's head. Bobo's night of torture had finally ended. His severely beaten, mutilated, and castrated body was found 3 days later at the bottom of the river, tied to that very ginny wheel that they forced him to carry. Last year, I turned 58 years old. I tell you my age because as a quinquagenarian, it sounds so much better than an old guy, I've lived through one of the most remarkable periods of the history of this country. My life is bookended by the murder of 14-year-old Emmett Lewis Till, the event that sparked the civil rights movement and ended up in the election of our first black president. The world that I was born in is much different from the one that we live in today. As a very young child, one of the first things that I remember was my mother telling me, no, sometimes even pleading with me, to be careful, to mind myself, and to remember what happened to Emmett Till. You see, Mom was extremely concerned about my well-being. Unlike my brothers and my cousins, I had this habit of openly questioning things that I felt were unjust. It just didn't make sense to me that it was all right to treat people with different skin colors in different ways. I simply could not accept there were laws on the books prohibiting people that looked like me from staying in public accommodations, from riding on trains and buses, and from eating at the lunch counter. I couldn't help but think how things had been so different when I was a kid compared to me going down with my white friends on an airplane to New Orleans, staying at the same hotel together. These traits that I had as a young man may seem like an admirable quality for a young person, but it was the late 50s and early 60s, and things were quite different back then. Every year, my family would take a 13-hour, 800-mile drive from Stamford, Connecticut to my grandparents' house in Orangeburg, South Carolina. I remember those days fondly. We'd pack things to eat into a cardboard shoebox. Things like tangerines, bread, fried chicken, and pound cake. We would then stop in White Plains, New York to pick up my Aunt Pearl. And I'm probably the only one in my family that says aunt. The rest of my family says aunt. You do that? To pick up my Uncle Legrand and my Uncle Walter at the toll plaza at the beginning of the New Jersey Turnpike. We would then trail each other in separate cars down I-95 to Washington, D.C. Eventually, we get on Route 301, which is a rural route, one lane each way, and we went through some very, very small and interesting towns. We did that because Interstate 95 had not been completed at the time. As we headed south, my mother and her siblings would talk about the joys and pains of growing up in a large black family in the South. My mother was the second youngest of 11 brothers and sisters that lived in a 3-bedroom house, 1 bedroom for the girls, 1 bedroom for the boys, and 1 bedroom for my grandparents. Things on the drive were rather normal to me until we stopped at Maryland House, which is a rest stop on I-95. We'd stop there and use the bathroom facilities while the adults would fill the car with gasoline for the next leg of our journey. We had just crossed the Mason-Dixon line. And even as a child, I realized the rest of the trip was somehow different. The adults were more on edge, more cautious, more careful in the words they chose when speaking to people that did not share our dark hues. We did not stop at motels or restaurants, and with very rare exceptions, we no longer took for granted that we could even use the restrooms at gas stations. As odd as things were then, my world was not as bad as it was. As odd as things were then, my world was not as bad as it was for my family members that came before me. Unlike my paternal great-great-grandparents, I didn't know the pain and personal indignities of slavery. Unlike my maternal grandfather, Edward, I never had to search for and find the body of a little brother who had been lynched because someone felt that he had disrespected them. I didn't have to feel the pain of Papa. I didn't have to feel the pain of Papa, who was my grandfather, Edward, when he saw German prisoners of war using whites-only water fountains that he and any other person of color would have gone to jail, been beaten, or killed for using. Unlike my mother, who had to walk for miles and miles to the colored schoolhouse while the white children riding buses threw rocks at her. No, I didn't have to suffer these kinds of indignities. But even during my lifetime, racist laws were still enforced. For example, laws against interracial marriage were still in effect until 1967. When I started law school in 1981 in the not-so-deep South, I attended a school in a state where Article 12, Section 8 of the Constitution stated, "White and colored persons shall not be taught in the same school." This offensive provision was not removed until 1994, 10 years after I graduated from law school. But even then, 42% of the population voted in favor of not changing it. Our society still has its share of problems, but things have changed dramatically since the days of Homer Plessy and Papa Dan. The battle is no longer whether people of color have the right to public access to public accommodations. Although people once risked life and limb to even sit at a lunch counter, in a twist of irony, the battle is somewhat tougher now. The battle lines are rarely clear. Things like implicit bias and implicit association are so much harder to see. Even upon self-reflection, we all have these issues, but we have the tools to make a difference. I think the Chief Justice was right on target when she said, "Think small, act large." As I mentioned earlier, we're in one of those uneasy periods of time, but I look to it as an opportunity. A lot of what was just under the surface has now been exposed. We can now have the open and honest conversations that we need to have to move us forward. Those difficult but necessary conversations about culture, about race, gender, sexuality that we so desperately need to have, but we always seem to have a way of avoiding. One day I was looking at the new notifications that had been posted by my friends on Facebook, and I saw that Scott Antonucci had posted an open letter on his wall. I asked Scott if I could read it to you today, and he said yes. I'd like to think that some of our dining table conversations had something to do with it. This is what Scott wrote. At the laundromat today, there was a black man sitting with his son. The kid was reading a book while munching on some snacks. He was maybe 6 years old, his father 30. Waiting for their clothes to dry, the father looked at his son, not at the book he was reading or at the snacks he was eating, but just sort of staring down at his face. He did this for a long time. Then his own face scrunched a bit. He kissed his son on top of the head, and he looked away and wiped his eyes. I wasn't close enough to notice if tears were present, but it didn't matter because they were present in my eyes. I don't know what the man was thinking, but I know what my thoughts were. Hold on to that child. Love him fiercely for every single moment he's in your life. Tell him this country is strange, and that because of his strangeness, for likely the entirety of his life, he will be judged in a different way. Tell him that it's not enough that he respect police officers as all children are taught, but in abundance of caution, tell him that it's not enough that he respect police officers as all children are taught, but he must use an abundance of caution. Tell him that some people are good, some people are bad, and some people just don't care. But none of that matters, because he can only rely on himself and his own good judgment. Tell him that some people in this country expect him to be expelled from school more than other kids. Tell him that some people in this country expect him to be arrested more than other kids, and that he may amount to nothing at all. Tell him that he may have to work twice as hard for half as much. Tell him to be proud of himself, proud of his blackness, proud of those that came before him and struggled so hard for so long for the freedoms that he enjoys. Tell him to continue to fight for those freedoms. Tell him history is on his side. Tell him justice is on his side. Tell him God is on his side. And tell him that you never want to stand in front of news cameras decrying the absurdity of his death, and that you hope he never has to stand in front of news cameras decrying the absurdity of yours. Tell him you love him every day. Every single gosh darn day. Or just, I don't know, maybe just kiss him on the head and tell him all that tomorrow. Maybe just let him be a 6-year-old for another day. It's a risk, but maybe. That's what was in my head anyway. I can't imagine what was in his, but a moment later, the man looked at me. I smiled through my tears. I'm sure he thought I was crazy. Maybe I am. Maybe we all are. Finally, in closing, I would like to leave you with the words of Ralph Waldo Emerson. To laugh often and much, to win the respect of intelligent people and the affection of children, to leave the world a better place, to know even one life has breathed easier because you have lived. This is to have succeeded. Thank you. I told Janet I wasn't sure if I can get through that without a tear. I didn't.
Your Honor, have a few minutes to take some questions if you'd like.
Okay. Does we have some time for questions? By the way, this is a picture of Emmett Till when he was shortly before his death, actually. That's me. Close to the same age. I still remember that red shirt. Remember I told you about going to South Carolina? This is us actually in North Carolina on our way to South Carolina. That's my older brother, that's me on the right, and that's my cousin Roger on the left, and that's my mom behind us. That's at my great-grandmother's house. That's me in the middle. And my older and younger brothers. The reason why I was going to use this picture is sort of interesting because I had just gotten out of the hospital. I had kidney failure. You can see I'm sort of swollen there. And that picture I don't remember taking, but I do remember an incident around that time, which was when I was in the hospital. I at first was in a semi-private room, and then I had some problems, so they put me into I don't even think they have these anymore, a children's ward. And so you're there with a lot of other children. And one day my father came in and I asked him, I said, Dad, what's a little black Sambo? And he said, why are you asking me that? And I said, well, the kid in the next bed said I was a little black Sambo. And so this was actually around the age where I first experienced that kind of trouble. That's my grandfather, Edward. Pop always smoked cigars, lived to be 86 years old. Probably would have been 96 without the cigar. But it was his younger brother who he searched for and found his body after he was lynched. That's my dad. Good looking guy. They say I look like him. You know what? Since we don't have questions yet, I think I'm going to do this. Should I? Yeah. Okay, cool. We're going to do an implicit association test. Please take a look at this. And you can see the colors: green, red, yellow, yellow, purple, blue, red, green, yellow, purple, right? Easy. Okay. I'm going to do something, and I need for you to answer as quickly as you possibly can. The only way this works is if you're honest with me and honest with yourselves and answer very quickly. Okay, we're going to read the next colors. Okay, with me as fast as you can. We're going to go from the top left, go right and down. Okay, top left. Green, next. Blue, green, red, yellow, yellow, purple, blue, red, green, yellow, purple. Yes! You guys are incredible. You're really good. We're going to do it again. Okay, go. Red, green, yellow, blue. No, give me the color. The color. No. The color. Give me the color. Green, blue, green. You know, the general public would not be very happy if they knew that their taxpayer dollars are going to you guys. But you see what happened there? You associate the color red with the word red, and that association is a tightly bound association. By doing what I just did to you, I separate the association. That's what we do not only with colors, we do it with all kinds of aspects of our culture. We do it with people. We do it with everything in our everyday life. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. It's probably connected to a survival instinct. But it shows you the problem of implicit association. Because when you do that with people, you take all those stereotypes that you learned from the time you were a small baby. You take those associations with you every single day. So if you've been subtly told through commercials and through TV and through movies that blacks are more violent, in your mind, you've taken violence and blacks and associated those things together. And those are the kind of programming that we're going to have all year. So that's a teaser. Those are the kind of things that the branch is experimenting with. Those are the kind of things that will help us get away from all those horrible things that I told you about that happened during Plessy versus Ferguson, that happened during my childhood. I want you to think positive about what's going to happen in the next few years and decades, because quite frankly, we live in a diverse society. And it will always be a diverse society. We have to learn how to get along with each other, how to relate, how to accept each other as equals. The alternative is just unthinkable. So, sorry about that little extra part, but does anybody have any questions? Well, thank you very much.
Thank you from us for doing this. You have people crying. We didn't bring tissues, but thank you so much.
Thank you. We have a fantastic judicial branch, and I'm actually going all over the country now. I just had to cancel a trip to Maryland. Didn't tell the chief I was going, where I was going to do a diversity training down at the University of Maryland. So what we're doing, when I said that we are the model of what's happening, of the way things should go, we are being recognized by national institutions for the work we're doing, and we're doing it internally. The fact that we don't have the money to do it hasn't slowed us down. We're an incredible group of people, and we got this. Trust me, we got this.
Thank you. Today we have an amazing set of speakers that are lined up, and we'd like to thank them for their time in presenting to us. After our opening here, you will be moving into your first registered breakout session. There will be time between these sessions for you to use the restroom and move to the next appropriate room. Restrooms are located out this door and to the right, so if you haven't figured that out, then that's easy. Please feel free to stop and ask any one of our wonderful volunteers who can be identified with their badges if you have any questions. At 11:30, your second breakout session will begin, and at 12:50, we will have our closing remarks back in this room. Thank you.